Who and how does not claim the Roman heritage? Only eagles with a Roman aquila did not put themselves on the flag or coat of arms, only lazy. Roman law, Roman military camps that became major European cities, Romance languages, second, third and other Rome, and other contenders for the most diverse parts of the Roman heritage. And one of the most curious cases here is one Balkan people who literally call themselves Romans, and their language is Roman. Roman in Romanian is a very slightly modified Latin Romanus Roman. And how did this even happen? Hello everyone, I am Yeager Ziryanov, and you are on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead, about history. And let's figure out today, where did the Romans come from in the Balkans, surrounded by southern Slavs, Hungarians, Turks, Greeks and whomever? And in general, let's answer the question, who are these Romanians of yours? But we will start with a little bit of another question, with the question, what language was spoken in Byzantium? It is not as easy to answer it as it seems, because in the Eastern Empire the main language was originally Latin, which was gradually replaced by Greek, but what kind of Greek it was, that's another question. At the same time, it must be said that Latin has never completely disappeared from use. Even after Middle Greek became the language of the court and documents under the Emperor Heraclius in the 7th century, there were very, very many people who considered Latin their native language. In the 10th century, Emperor Constantine Bagranarodny even divided the entire population of the empire into Greek-speaking Romani and Latin-speaking Romani. And no, the gypsies probably have nothing to do with it. At the same time, already in the 7th century, Byzantine historians write that they do not understand what language commoners speak in the province. It seems to be similar to both Latin and Borscht at the same time. It's not clear what to do with it. So to the south of the Danube, there will be a Romanian language, on the Adriatic, a Dalmatian language, so that the inhabitants of one small exarchate in the west of the empire, who turned their lands into a prosperous trading republic. Yes, also originally Romanesque. To the north of the Danube, on the territory of modern Romania, Latin-speaking Romanians will also live. And there, too, a local version of it will be formed, literally the Romance language. That's just that they are historically much less lucky than the same Venetians. Friends, where and how do you watch our videos? I personally consume quite a lot on YouTube, both entertainment content and popular science, and often do it anywhere. On trains, on planes, at airports, or without getting out of bed, resting after the previous points. Actually, I work or just surf the internet in about the same way. And if you want to have a working tool, a high-quality ebook, or a convenient device for watching movies and YouTube always at hand, regardless of whether you are flying on an airplane, riding the subway, or having breakfast at the table without leaving your workplace, then I can recommend you the next Paper 11. A tablet with a very cool feature. It will not burn out your eyes after long use, thanks to its special matte screen, which, by the way, does not glare, being very bright. Vision protection is confirmed by the International Tufralen certificate. And this is very cool, because, let's face it, tablets are primarily needed for content consumption. And here you can do this for a very, very, very long time. Yes, you understood correctly, in addition to eye protection, and a special black and white mode for reading. There is also an excellent battery, for 8000 mAh, so if you want, you can watch movies while crossing the Atlantic without stopping. Moreover, 128 gigabytes of memory quite allow these movies to be uploaded there. If you prefer to watch TV shows without getting out from under the covers, then this is also a good option. There is a very respected screen with 4 speakers that work in stereo mode. Look to your health. The microphone, by the way, is also not 1, but 2, and the voices are transmitted very clearly, which is useful if you have a lot of buzzers and the quality of the microphones is critical for you. The baby weighs only 469 grams and is generally quite compact, 6 and 9 millimeters thick. Well, if you miss styluses or you like to draw on a tablet, then the Tesla Paper 11 offers you such an opportunity. It recognizes up to 4096 taps, and the surface of the tablet is very similar to paper. It feels like you're drawing on an ordinary sheet of paper. Choose a tablet in dark purple or dark gray. Read, watch videos, draw, or just scroll through memes. To do this, now click on the link in the description, follow it, study everything yourself, and then come back to us. Romania generally consists of several things. Memes about gypsies and about Dracula, the strongest rugby team in Europe, and of course, an incredible geographical mix of the Carpathian Mountains in the northwest and steppe plains in the southeast, a continuation of the Great Steppe. And then everything came out more balanced than the nutrition of your Instagram coach. Problems were constantly coming from the steppes, and in the mountains, it was possible to hide from these problems. But more on that later. Initially, this area was called Dacia, inhabited, logically, by Dacians, and, what is no longer so logical, by Geta. Because I always thought that the Gets lived behind the Perseus Veil. The Dacian state even resisted the Romans relatively effectively. Emperor Trojan had to fight twice to conquer, but in the 106th year, the border of the empire still began to pass through the Carpathians. And then it turned out that this was the edge of the map. It was very difficult to expand further. And during a worthy separate video of the crisis of the 3rd century, when Rome almost glued the flippers, Emperor Aurelian decided to withdraw his troops and strengthen himself already beyond the Danube. The Dacians descended from the mountains, and a kind of renaissance of the Doki culture began, because the mountains are cool. Guerrilla warfare in the mountains allows you to perfectly preserve the local original culture. Except that in addition to the mountains in Dacia, there were also steppes. In the 4th century, the Sarmatians came from them to Dacia, then the Germans Teifels, followed by the Goths. In the 5th century, the Huns came, hitting the previous guests on the neck. Then Attila died. Dacia was occupied by the Germans, Hypids, and Lombards with their kingdoms, in the 6th century. The Germans were driven out by the Avar Khaganate. In the 7th century, the Bulgarians crossed the Danube. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Hungarians rode through Dacia. In the 11th century, these lands were captured by the Pechenegs, who 100 years later were ousted by the Polevsians. After which the Mongols came, after which the Hungarian king gave these lands to the Teutonic Order. Soon after which semi-independent principalities appeared on them, you won't believe it, local residents, speaking the Romance language. All the time that the region served as a gateway for the great migration of peoples, the local Latin-speaking population has not gone anywhere. When the legionnaires and officials left after Aurelian, the locals, of course, remained to finish the pilum without salt, but still survived. Of course, cities very quickly came to the state of the Russian province in the early 90s, but, nevertheless, in rural areas, everything was relatively good, because it is much easier to feed yourself in this very rural area. Moreover, they had to feed on cattle breeding. When at any moment some Pechenegs can come and burn your fields, then raising sheep that can literally be dragged into the mountains under your arm is a very rational strategy. Additionally, the situation was facilitated by the fact that the Danube is not the channel. The legions left, but some trade with Rome continued, and after the latter adopted Christianity. Some recaptured monks would even build monasteries across the Danube. You can compare all this with Britain, where after the departure of the Romans, the apocalypse of local proportions really came. But nevertheless in Dacia, everything was much simpler. The future Romanians, as you have already understood, managed to keep even Latin as the main language. And this is generally a separate miracle, because the Romans ruled Dacia for only a century and a half, which is not so much for the rooting of the language, and apparently, the role of contact with the empire and the specifics of the province of Moesia bordering Dacia played here. There were really no ancient Greek cities there, but there were legions gathered from all over the empire. So the only way out was to communicate in Latin, which continued in Moesia, even when Greek had already become dominant in the Eastern Empire. This is how the people were formed, which the neighbors called Voleks, Vialas or Moravlas. This word actually goes back to the pro-German Volkas, which originally simply meant foreigners. And so the Germanic peoples called many of their neighbors. In particular, the Celtic peoples were lucky, so, for example, Valicia arose, and the Vallones seemed to be from the same place. And even the Gauls seemed to have a similar root. But the Slavs decided on a small plot twist in this linguistic story, and began to call the Romans by the word magus, which meant all Roman-speaking peoples in general. polish and lock, Italy is from here. And at some point, the culture of the Wallachians began to differ so much from its Byzantine original, that the Byzantines themselves began to call the former Romanes Balalami. By the way, if you think that the problem for the Wallachians was only the endless nomads of the steppe before the cursed empire of the West, then I have news for you. Another major wave that hit the lands of Dacia was the Slavic resettlement. The first Slavic settlements on the Old River date back to the 6th century, and with the advent of the Avar Khaganate. And then the Bulgarian kingdom, where the Slavs were vassals, there were only more of them. Southern Slavs settled on the Danube, in the future Wallachia, and Eastern Slavs settled on the Rods, in the future Moldova. The same Ulichi and Tivertsi form the tale of bygone years. If we talk about Slavic colonization, then in the 10th century in Transylvania, such people as Ruthenians or Ruthenians are celebrated. And later, Romanian historians still single out the people of Viteras Rus, designating the Slavs as such, who have already densely mixed with the local population. Literally, it literally translates as ancient Rus. Whether they fought with the lizards' history is silent. But some fans of denouncing reptiloids like to use these same Ruthenians as an argument against the Norman origin of Russia. They say, here are Ruthenians, Rus, and even some Rus, ancient, while without Kievan or Norman origin. Everything is obvious. However, the reverse hypothesis is not considered marginal. Most historians still assume that this is either one of the branches of the Varangians or some descendants of mercenaries from Kievan Rus. And there are also theories that derive these Rus not from Russia, but from the Thracian word Rus, which means a pit or, more privately, a mine. Well, hinting at an obvious professional affiliation. And, by the way, the word Jupa originally had the same meaning, which the Slavs in the Balkans called their principalities. But I probably won't develop this idea. But even with all this, it cannot be denied that the Slavic influence on the ancestors of modern Romanians was quite great. Even in modern Romanian, up to 20% of oral speech, and up to 10% of written speech, use Slavic words and constructions in one way or another. Slavic roots can be traced there both lexically and syntactically. More importantly, the future Romanians adopted Orthodoxy, for which thanks not only to the Slavic settlers, but also to the Bulgarian kingdom, which included the lands of the Alas. In Bulgaria, church services were conducted in Church Slavonic, so as a result, Church Slavonic will become the official language of the Romanian lands, and will remain in this status until the 19th century. And here I want to award all Malaks, all Romanians with the Order of Magnificent Game. Because while in Western Europe, for example, everyone prayed in Latin and spoke local languages, here everything was exactly the opposite. Everyone spoke Latin, and at the same time prayed, in Church Slavonic. I like it. Because of all this, at some point even the writing was translated into the racially faithful Bulgarian Cyrillic alphabet. It's as if a well-known alphabet would be used in Italian, for example. Moreover, in Romania, the language will be translated back into Latin only in 1860. And in Moldova, the Cyrillic alphabet will remain as long as 94th. Another thing is that for a very long time, the ancestors of Romanians were generally of little interest to anyone. From time to time, in the Byzantine, German, or Hungarian chronicles, the Roman name of some local leader, who was designated as a Scythian or Bulgarians, or in general as anyone, would slip through. Everything began to change when the Hungarians came to Europe in the 11th century and conquered their homeland on the plains of Pannonia. And what, by the way, we had a separate big video about, see the tips. At the same time, the Hungarians conquered Transylvania, literally enslaving the locals. That is, the Roman-speaking Orthodox population massively received the designation serf in the workbook, while other local nationalities such as Hungarians and German colonists received their class representations. The Wallachians were not even mentioned anywhere because power is for Catholics. But the Orthodox did not pay tithes. That's why you always have to choose between political rights and low taxes. Disgusting elections. On the other hand, thanks again to the Carpathian Mountains, it was really difficult for Hungarians to control these lands. As a result, they made a brilliant move in 1211th year. They gave the Carpathians to the Teutonic Order, taking from that promise to keep the border with the Pelovsians. Then something sudden happened. 10 years later, the knights decided that they needed their own state, decided to bypass the Hungarian monarch, to swear directly to the Vatican, but no luck, no luck. The Hungarians just sighed, smacked the Teuton on the horned helmet, and took the Carpathians back with all this headache. Then, they tried to transfer the territories to the Order of the Hospitallers, the future Knights of Malta, about which, by the way, we also had a separate video, but in the end it didn't work out, and in the 13th century, they simply created a stamp on the border with the Mongols, a border buffer area. And since the main task of the brand was a border war with pagans, first with the Polevsians, and then with the Mongols, Hungary decided to rely on the local Christian, albeit Orthodox, population. Yes, that is, on those very Wallachians, who, by the way, in Hungarian sources were already called Romanians, well, Romans. Romanian society at that time. Well, it was a weak society. There were no administrative structures, but there were rural communities that were governed by Judas from the Latin judex judge, or princes, that is, princes. There were also feudal lords who were called boyars by the Bulgarian term. By the way, yes, in Romanian terminology, a prince is a minor nobleman, or even a free peasant, that is, the princes were lower than the boyars, if anything. To protect themselves from external threats, communities and feudal lords united in alliances, which were headed by elected voivodes. And this is the society. The Hungarian stamp system forced me to take an express course of statehood. Temporary elected voivodes very quickly turned into normal such feudal lords, and soon there were titles of great voivodes, something like counts or dukes. But at the same time, the Hungarian kings, as I have already said, did not completely control this province. So everything ended quite naturally. The uprising. At the beginning of the 14th century, a certain Bessarab was elected governor of eastern Wallachia, who did not pay much attention to the Hungarian authorities. At some point, he not only began to wage his own wars, but also conquered western Wallachia. The king of Hungary decided to punish the vassal, promised to pull him by the beard, and declared war on him. And, strictly speaking, Bessarab was actually ready to immediately surrender in this war and apologize. Maybe even on camera and so on. But His Majesty decided that all this was not enough, and it was necessary to humiliate the rebellious Bessarabian. And that was a mistake. Suddenly it turned out that the Hungarians were poorly prepared for the war. The Romanians used scorched earth tactics, and as a result, the Hungarian army was surrounded in a narrow gorge at the Posad. 3 days later, this very army simply ceased to exist. The war, however, continued, and in 1345, the son of Bessarab agreed to formal neutrality. In fact, the only thing the Hungarians have achieved is to open the Breel Highway for them, a strategic communication that connected Hungary with the Black Sea. Almost simultaneously, another border voivode, Begdanda, rose up. He and his army came to Moldova and seized power there. And everything happened there according to approximately the same scenario. The war lasted for a long time, but in 1387 year, the ruler of Moldova, Peter Mushat, finally separated the region from Hungary and began to pay tribute to the King of Poland. Both of these states, of course, formally remained vassals. Wallachia swore allegiance to Hungary and Moldova to Poland, but in fact there was only one name firm vassalage. The rulers of both of these powers took the title of the house, which translates as Lord, and with us, as a rule, it translates as Lord. But there is an interesting point here, because this title can be interpreted in two ways. Firstly, this, of course, may simply be an adaptation of the Greek title despot, but at the same time, it can be interpreted as a kind of form of the title to minus. And yes, you got it right, this is the title of the Roman emperors. The guys had plenty of show-offs. Then the chronicle begins. Moreover, in Moldova, it was an unambiguous soft power tool. There were even specially created so-called Moldova Russian, Moldova German, and Moldova Polish chronicles in foreign languages for foreign courts. This is medieval per. And yet, for example, there was such a text as the Legend of Dracula Voivode. The text has been preserved only in the list in Russian, made in 1491 year, in the Kirillovo-Belozersk monastery, and in the Russian-language Wikipedia, you will read that this is a monument of Russian literature. However, Romanians believe that the text was written in Wallachia, and this is just a translation. In fact, many nations claim authorship, but it's not the point that matters. In any case, the legend describes the life of Vlad Dracula from a position in Alahia, and, of course, Dracula is not vampires there and not even a fan of impaling someone, but a Christian ruler and a fighter for the Orthodox faith against the Turks. Now I want an icon of the most holy Orthodox Alucard, defender of the faith. I hope we won't offend anyone. The Orthodox faith occupies a separate place in the history of Romania in general. In the 16th century, the ruler of Nagoy generally proclaimed himself no less than the heir of Byzantium, and used the symbolism with a double-headed eagle. Yes, you understood correctly, Bucharest is the third Rome. How? It is also worth saying thanks for such constructions, of course, to the Renaissance, when it became fashionable to look for ancient roots again. The reputation of the defenders of Christianity was not very strong. Some Mircea the Old, or the same Vlad Dracula in Allah, or Stefan the Great in Moldova, could at the moment conduct good military operations against the Ottoman Empire. But the forces were too unequal, and the principalities held on only as long as Hungary or Poland stood behind them. And there were problems with this in the 16th century. In 1526 year, the Ottomans captured the future Budapest, and some fragments remained of Hungary, for which the Habsburgs and the rulers of Transylvania fought. Poland, in 1569 year, concluded the Union of Lublin with Lithuania, forming the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, after which the Poles got into the ongoing wars between Lithuania and Moscow. And gradually, the Moscow sovereigns, and not the Ottoman sultans, became the main threat, and the main enemies for Warsaw. So neither of them was particularly concerned with Yes in Allah and Moldova. Constantinople, of course, took advantage of this. In 1538, the Sultan's 200,000 army marched through the principalities with fire and sword. As a result, Moldova lost access to the sea, and in Allah its northeastern part. And both of these principalities became vassals of the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, there was a special concept for these lands. If in canonical Islam, there is only the land of Islam and the land of war, then the Ottomans also had the land of the treaty, Dar al-Ath. In other words, the vassal caliphs in Constantinople are Christian principalities. Georgia, for example, existed on the same status. All these lands had to obey the caliph, send him taxes there, some part of the troops, but in general, they could live according to their own laws and rules. Of course, the Ottomans actively interfered in the process of choosing a ruler. In the most hardcore cases, the sultans officially appointed a new ruler before the elections, after which they hinted to the local boyars who should be elected. And to heighten control, the elections were held in the presence of Turkish soldiers. In a milder version, the sultan's envoys simply filtered the candidates, allowing them to choose from several clearly pro-Turkish ones. They were regularly deposed before the end of their lives, but they were often elected several times during this very life. Such are the electoral jokes. But even such rulers were not always more loyal. The uprising of Mihai the Brave in 1595 year is a vivid example. He even managed at some point to unite Wallachia, Moldova, and Transylvania under his independent rule. But his beginnings, the ideas of revival, ruined him. He called himself the Prince of Dacia, and, in the spirit of the era, even began the gradual replacement of the Church Slavonic as the official language with Romanian. So the Transylvanian cities immediately rebelled against him, where the local German population did not want to obey the Vlach tyrant. And as a result, Mihai was killed, and his state disintegrated by 1601. The Mihai uprising was not the only one. The Ottomans tightened the screws in response, and all this together, of course, strengthened local self-awareness, which led, first of all, to the fact that when the Ottoman Empire weakened in the 18th century, the neighbors began to actively talk about the liberation of the Balkan peoples. In 1781, Catherine II, as part of her Greek project, even proposed to create a kind of buffer state of Dacia from Moldova and Wallachia between Russia, Austria, and Turkey. Then the plan was not implemented, but with each defeat, Turkey was forced to grant the principality more and more independence. And in the end, they made something like a demilitarized zone out of Wallachia and Moldova, forbidding the Ottoman Empire to send troops there. In parallel, under the influence of the Enlightenment, what can be called the Romanian national idea arises. In 1716 year, Constantine Cantacuzene wrote a history in Alachia, by the way, in Romanian. And a little later, Dmitri Cantemir will write a chronicle of the old Romanian Mold Vlachs. Their ideas boiled down, in general, to two main points. The first one is the Romanesque population of Wallachia, Moldova, and Transylvania, in fact one people, whose ancestors are half Dacians and half Romans. Secondly, this people are called Romanians. It's funny that by this point, the word Romanian was actually used. But it had been used for some time as an offensive nickname for commoners, and now it has become a national designation. In Transylvania, which belonged to Austria, the situation developed in approximately the same direction. Although the situation of Romanians there has not improved much since the Middle Ages, they still acted as a dependent peasant minority. But at the end of the 17th century, the so-called Counter-Reformation began in the Habsburg lands. And within the framework of this Counter-Reformation, local Orthodox tried to transfer back under the control of the Roman Catholic Church. And I must say that even relatively successfully. In the year 1700, the Romanian Greek Catholic Church was established in the city of Alba Iulia. And this is an interesting point, because this event, which, as a rule, is perceived as an act of oppression, in fact, played to the Romanians for the benefit. Look, Romanians themselves were deprived of political rights, but at the same time, the Greek Catholic clergy had a quota in local estate bodies. Only one seat in the Transylvanian Council, but nevertheless. In fact, now the Romanians have political representatives, and already in 1732nd year, the Transylvanian Council will raise the issue of the liberation of Romanians from serfdom. Greek Catholic Bishop Inocentie Mica will raise this issue, and the issue of equality for Romanians in general. Serfdom will indeed be abolished in 1785th year, but in principle, issues related to the Romanian nation will remain a headache for the Habsburgs until the very end of their empire. Well, in the 19th century, under the influence of the Napoleonic Wars, a full-fledged national movement unfolded in Wallachia and Moldova. Then the Romanian society itself began to change. It was still agrarian, but the number of citizens doubled. The abolition of the Turkish trade monopoly has created a new middle class, and the old boyars have changed. After Turkey lost another war with Russia and was forced to grant amnesty to all those who fought on the side of Russia, boyar youth returned from emigration to Wallachia and Moldova, who had lived in Europe all their lives and considered themselves enlightened Europeans because of this. At the same time, national media appeared in Romanian. Many nationalists directly called themselves carbonari, that is, compared themselves with the participants of the national movement in Italy. However, the first pancake came out lumpy. During the Greek Revolution of 1821, an uprising began in Wallachia. Moreover, its leader Tudor Vladimir Escu, just one of such returning immigrants, was able to take power in the principality for a while. But everything went wrong, thank God. The rebels did not wait for help from Russia. Because Alexander I considered them rebels of the Turkish Sultan as the legitimate ruler, the war dragged on. And, as often happens, conflicts began in the camp of revolutionaries, as a result of which Vladimir Escu was accused of working for the Turks, and executed on the orders of the commander of the rebellious Greeks Alexander and Salanti. And then the uprising disintegrated and was suppressed. In Greece, the war went on for another 7 years, and only after Alexander I died, and the new Emperor Nicholas decided to enter the war with Turkey, they managed to achieve independence. In Ala and Moldova, after the war, they found themselves in a rather strange situation. Russian governor ruled there for 5 years according to the German peace treaty, which ended the Russo-Turkish War. Both of these principalities were occupied by Russian troops for 5 years. He was called the chairman of 2 sofas, that is, the head of 2 parliaments at once, in Ala and Moldova. And on the one hand, Russian troops were stationed there, among other things, in order to prevent a new uprising. On the other hand, the Russian administration in the principalities did what Nicholas I did not allow to be done in Russia itself. She launched a large-scale reform program, and this was done not from above, but as a result of consultations with the local boyars. That is, almost in a parliamentary way. In 1831st year, under the chairman of the 2 sofas Pavel Kisilyev, an organic regulation was adopted in the principalities. He created people's assemblies in the principalities, before which there were responsible governments, and the lords in turn turned into something like lifelong presidents, whom these people's assemblies elected. That is, yes, the military governor from Tsarist autocratic Russia introduced a constitution in the future Romania. Something similar, and then it was done under Alexander II in Bulgaria. But it was somehow difficult to expect it from Nicholas I. It is surprising with all this that the regulations even suggested such a variant of events, in which the ruler is removed from power for violating the constitution, and this really happened. In 1842nd year, the ruler of Wallachia will really be impeached and removed from power. And Romanian has finally become the state language, and Church Slavonic has remained only the language of the church. There was just one problem. The organic regulations did not prohibit serfdom. There were attempts to regulate it, but the standards of the corvée, which were introduced, and everything only worsened. As a result, in the 48th year, on the wave of the Spring of the Peoples, a real revolution broke out in Alahia, which had to be crushed by introducing Turkish troops. And then the Crimean War happened. We usually forget this, but under the terms of the Paris Peace, Russia lost the right to deploy troops in Ala and Moldova. The principalities became something of a buffer between Russia and Turkey. But the question remained, what to do with the principalities? Foreign Minister Walewski proposed to unite them into one integral state, as if a vassal of Turkey, but at the same time, under the protectorate of the great powers. They could not make a clear decision at the Paris conference. France, Russia, Sardinia and Prussia were in favor, Austria and Turkey were against, England abstained. In general, everyone expressed extreme concern, and allowed the region to sort itself out, by holding a referendum in the principalities. But it wasn't necessary. In 1859th year, the same person won the elections in both Moldova and Wallachia, Alexander Ion Cuza. The very fact that one person is running for 2 thrones, in fact, has already surprised the whole of Europe, but when he won, Cuza himself called it direct proof of the existence of a single Romanian nation. The funny thing here is that formally he remained the head of 2 different states, because it was directly prohibited by international law to unite them. But it was not forbidden, for example, to carry out the same laws, create a single army, and so on. Do you know how Turks like to talk about Azerbaijanis? They say, 1 people, 2 states. So, Romanians are asking to support their beer. In fact, not everyone supported Cuza, of course. The ultraliberals were dissatisfied with the lack of radicalism of the reforms. The same abolition of serfdom was copied from the Russian law with all its shoals like ransom payments and a temporarily obligated state. The conservatives were simply dissatisfied with any reforms, and as a result, in 1866, the conspirators broke into the palace, forced the prince to sign the abdication, took him abroad, and then it turned out that before bringing this plan into a state of implementation, none of its participants agreed what to do next with everything this. And at that moment, the history of Romania, which had barely begun, almost ended right there. Because the alliance of Moldova and Wallachia rested precisely on the authority of Cuza. And demonstrations for secession from Romania immediately began in Moldova. As a compromise, they began to look for rulers from the outside, and after sorting through various European persons with blue blood, they settled on Karl Hohenzollern Sigmaringen. He became the king of the United Romania, already in the 66th, but recognition had to wait for a very long time. Only at the Berlin Congress in 1881, after the Russian-Turkish War, Romania was officially recognized as a single state. Well, in 1918, after the First World War and the collapse of Austria-Hungary, which, by the way, we also had a separate video in the tips, it's big and cool, Transylvania became part of Romania. Well, the residents of the Italian capital, as well as the residents of Rome, Georgia, can only put up with the fact that there are other Romans besides them, internationally recognized in this form, and using this word as a self-designation. This story still seems a little strange to me, but it's pretty cool. By the way, if you rightly noticed, that almost nothing was said about the fate of Bessarabia, which will become the modern Republic of Moldova, then you should know that this was done quite deliberately. This is too special a plot to consider it simply in the context of the general Romanian history. So if you want a separate detailed video about this, then do not forget to write about it in the comments and like this video. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. Thanks to all those holders of foreign cards who support us on Patreon, and Russian bank cards who support us on Boost. Don't forget that you can also become one of these people to watch the videos first, and do it without integrative advertising. And also if you want to ask us any question in our closed Telegram chat. By the way, subscribe to Telegram too. I constantly urge you to do this. Thanks to everyone else who watches these videos. Do not forget to send them to your friends until next week.